Okay, cool. So let's say you're not using Alchemy. Let's say we want to use one of the other synths in Logic. So another really good one for this is so just first of all, if you go to Software Instrument and click down here, you're going to see like a number of different synths going on down here. So the one that I wanted to turn to next is what's called Retro Synth, and I actually think this is one of the best synths, if not the best synth in Logic. So if I go to Retro Synth and press Stereo and then go to Create, I'm going to get a new channel and it's going to look like this. Now, these synths are basically, so retro synth is based on like a analog synth design, and analog synths work in a particularly subtractive analog synths work in a certain way, which I'll explain in a second. But this design is pretty true to how it works in real life, in the sense of, you know, you've got to kind of manually set it up and you've got to like acknowledge a signal path and all that stuff. So we'll talk about that in a second, but like the sounds themselves are really good in here. And it's a good opportunity for you to build really good dry synth sounds, because something that Alchemy does is that, you know, you might have a dry synth sound, but it will also add delay, reverb, I don't know, glide. It's probably going to be adding like tremolo or something like that, and you know, it's doing a lot of that sound design work for you. So in retro synth, it gives you an opportunity to build like a really solid bass sound that sorry, as in like a not bass like bass, I mean like base bass sound for you to then build off to make a more advanced synth sound. So let's have a look at this. So if you're new to synths, here's how synth works. So in a subtractive synth, what you've got is what's called an oscillator. So an oscillator makes the sound, and it does that by producing a wave. Now the waves can be different shapes, and when sound waves are different shapes, they make different sounds. So if you've got a smooth wave, like that sounds smooth, chances are it's what's called a sine wave, which is literally a smooth, like, you know, like you've kind of the classic drawing of a wave. But you've also got triangle, you've got square waves, which sound more abrasive because they're square. You've got what's called a sawtooth wave. So there are lots of different types of like basic oscillator. So if I go, for example, here, what this is showing me in this top left panel is my oscillators are 1 and 2, and I've got a mixer here between the two of them. So if I go to oscillator 1, I'm only listening to oscillator 1 at this point. So I'll press a note, that's what I'm hearing. So this is a sawtooth wave. So if I go to a square, two completely different sounds. So I can my first thing is to choose what kind of sound I want there, right? Also here you can kind of like offset the square a little bit so it becomes a bit lopsided, and you get this like really kind of like bitey sensation there. So you don't have to have a classic, you can kind of go into a more like almost like an FM space. But for the minute, we're going to stay there. The other option you've got with oscillator 1 here is noise. So a lot of, and this, if you're just starting out in synths, you might be like, why would you want noise? Because noise sounds like this. It's a tough sell, right? But the point here, you want noise because sounds natural, and like most things in nature that are like have broadband noise are pretty natural. Like a waterfall has broadband noise because you're basically just bombarding with sound. So if you blend something with noise, it can actually make it feel more like natural and less synthetic. It also just sounds cool as well, particularly if you're working in higher frequencies, because like, you know, using white noise and using noise in general is like a really it's quite an exciting thing, and it's something that really builds that kind of sense of excitement in the track sometimes. So you can use that for that as well. So let's just say for the minute we want to go with a square wave, right? And then I'm going to blend this with a second sound. So I'm going to go down to oscillator 2, and I'm going to choose, say, a triangle wave, which isn't available in my top one. That's a triangle wave. So let's say that's triangle, that's square, triangle, square. So what I can do is I can blend these together. And now I've got a combination of the two oscillators. Now, depending on what synth you're using, like, you know, whether it's analog or it's another digital one, you know, you can have multiple oscillators going. So like, you know, Moogs famously will have up to, you know, like a sub 37 Moog has like two oscillators. a sub oscillator, and then a noise oscillator as well. So you could have a combination of 4. But different synths have different combinations, and they'll also give you different choices of waves and all that kind of stuff. But the good thing is here is you can build like a sound that you want straight off the bat. Now the second section here is what's called a filter. So in subtractive synthesis, what happens with the filter is basically you're taking away part of the frequency range. So if I just open my filter up here, where are we? And press play, you can hear there's a lot of high frequencies that weren't there before. Now what a filter's doing is it's basically permanently removing part of the frequency range so that you're tailoring the tone of your sound. So if I want this to sound darker, I can bring this filter down, take out, so my high frequencies would be here. This is an EQ graph. And this low bit is what's being let through. So now it sounds like that. So you can feel it's a completely different tone. Like if I've got something moving down here, feels completely different, right? So I'm just going to leave that there. And that's basically going to allow me to just like have a different look at my sound. Now the thing with filters is that you've got different types of filters. So in the same way that if you're used to EQ, you've got like low cut, high cut, otherwise called high pass filter, low pass filter. Then what you can do here is you can basically go, okay, I'm going to change from LP, low pass, to HP, which would be the other way around. So, I mean, look, they've got these names like creamy, gritty, just because it's like the kind of shape that they're cutting. But like, just try them out; they'll sound different. And the 6 dB, 12 dB, 24 dB is what's called the slope, and that's basically how steep the cut is that it's operating on. So if I take like we'll go with the creamy one, and if I raise this, you'll start to hear the bass fall out. So it might be that I just want the high energy to like kind of prop up another synth sound, for example. Or I could use 2. I could have one synth that's like just holding down my lows, and I could bring in a second layer that's just holding down my highs. And I can design those 2 things differently because I've filtered them. I think a classic, well, I'd say a beginner mistake with layering will be to layer 2 completely broadband sounds on top of each other. So if you've got 2 bass sounds and you just layer the whole bass sound on top of each other unfiltered, you're going to, unless they're very, very complementary, you're going to end up with issues there because you're just loading energy into particularly your low end. Whereas with this, what you could do is you could say, okay, I'm going to have 3 layers. I'm going to have one with my lows, one with my mids, and one with my highs. And when you slot them all together, because you've designed them, they'll sound much more assertive because you're covering the whole frequency band range. Sorry, you're covering the whole frequency range, but you're doing it in a thought out way. So yeah, filters are a great way. The last filter that we're looking at here is what's called BP, which is band pass. So with this, you basically get both. So you can go like this. So I'm only going to listen to my mids now. Same thing. Like if you've done one with high and one with low, you might do one with band to hold your mids down, and then you've got like the whole frequency spectrum covered. Cool. So you can see at the bottom here you've got 3 other dials. We're going to come back to those, so remember those. But for the minute, we're going to just carry on. So you've got your volume here, and you've got your amp level here as well. And what this does is it will add a sub element to your track. Sub element to your synth sound, which is a sine wave. So you see where it says sine level? Earlier I was talking about the smooth sine waves. So your smooth sine wave is this. And what it will do is it will blend a 3rd oscillator with your track and give you a bit of smooth sounding sine wave. See? So now this is just an option if you want to smooth it out, but it's a good way, particularly if you're using bass sounds, and in particular drawing out bass sounds, to give that kind of like low end, like sub gravity, which is great. Okay, cool. So let's have a look at the next part. So a flanger is an effect, and we'll do that one last, just for the sake of building like a really good dry sound here. The next one is one that's like really popular. A lot of people don't realize that they're listening to glide when they hear it. This is also called Portamento on some synths. Portamento coming from like the classical kind of tradition, you know, like pianissimo, fortissimo, that kind of stuff. So what this does is it basically slides between two notes. So if I turn my glide on, what I'm doing here at the time is I'm basically saying, okay, how long am I going to slide between these two notes? So if it's 0, it's not going to slide. It'll just go. That's what you'd expect, right? I'm just going to switch this back to a low pass filter just so that I've got like a bit more meat in my synth. But if I turn my time up on the glide, listen to what happens here. You can hear it now sliding between the two. And the longer I open it up, so this gives you a whole different like flavor to your synth. So if you pull this down, you can have a very percussive synth sound. It's like bum 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 bum, just completely on the rhythm. If I bring this even a little bit in, you're just going to feel more natural. Because it's kind of just like moving in like in a way that like legato players would on like on an instrument, right? You've also got opportunities here to basically only glide certain oscillators. So if I only want to glide like, well, as it says, if I want to glide like just oscillator 1 and my sine oscillator, which is here, so shape 1 and sine level, then I can just set it to that and it will only glide those two and leave oscillator 1 to just change as it would. You can hear that moving around in the background. So there's now two sounds going in layers. So it's an idea, but I mean, glide is all over music, even in particular, like if you're using, it doesn't have to just be like, you know, like analog synth stuff. I mean, if you're using like 808 samples or you're using like lead parts or whatever, like glide is going to just give you that feel of like movement. Yeah, so that's what glide does. Now, the bits at the bottom here, you might be like, okay, what the hell is this? This is like some kind of next graph stuff that I just do not understand. But the actual principle of it is quite simple. So on the left, you've got what are called LFOs, right? And they're called LFOs because it stands for low frequency oscillator. And that's quite a confusing term. So it basically sounds like it should be like low frequency, like that's low. And in some ways it is because it's a low frequency, i.e. the time like oscillate. It's a low frequency wave, and the slower the wave, the lower it is. But what it's doing here is you're basically using an LFO to push. You're putting one oscillator over the top of the other one, and it's basically going to move across the signal, which gives you the effect of it moving, pulsing with the oscillation. So an example of this would be if I turn my LFO up here and I just set this, you should be able to hear. So I've got a very low frequency, i.e. like rate of frequency, oscillator there, and it's just moving across my other signal. So the oscillators up here are being influenced by this oscillator, which is then going to start creating movement. Now this is a really big one if you're trying to make like movement in your track and you're trying to give like a sense of like whether it's like pulsing or it's a sense of swing, it could be if you're trying to do that kind of thing. But like generally speaking, like you're going to want to like have your synths have at least some movement so they don't just sound like and it's just like completely flat. So in the same way with the oscillators up here, like because it's an oscillator, you can choose what kind of wave it is. So like if you set it to square, you're going to hear it's just going to change the nature of it. Very binary sound. Duh, 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 duh. Whereas triangle is more up down. So you can feel like already that you're creating two completely different things. So you've got sawtooth, more percussive, feels very different to this though, which is more like a tremolo. So that's a really nice like way of setting this up. And this is why I said I'll come back to these things here, right? Because in your filter, what I'm able to do is assign my LFO to my filter. So it's going to basically bring in, my, what I've chosen here as my filter via the LFO. So if I, for example, you can hear when I bring the LFO in, it's not taking all the signal out. It's just bringing the highs out because that's what I've asked it to do. If I bring this all the way down, you can hear it's just influencing it as I'm using the filter. So the filter frequency that you've got here and the LFO are linked in this model. Okay, so it's a really nice. It's a really nice way of using synths, and in particular this one. But the great thing about this is that you and we'll come to this in a minute when we talk about like just how to make it feel a bit more analog. This is a good way of making it feel a bit more analog, and we'll come back to that. So this is one thing. Now another great touch with this, which you don't have on a lot of particularly old synths, is a sync function. So on modern synths, if you're as in analog synths, if you're using a MIDI controller, what will happen is that basically your DAW will inform your synth of what your BPM is. It will basically inform it of what's called a clock, right? So it will basically say, I'm working to this time, you should work on this time as well. And what that allows you to do is sync stuff. But older synths didn't have that; they didn't even have MIDI. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to by ear pretty much just dial in what you like heard was the right rate. And there's a real kind of beauty to that as well, because it is, if something's slightly off like that, it can also create a great feel. But in here, you've got what's called sync. So I can basically turn this. See, when it's off, I've got to choose my actual wave frequency. Whereas when it's on, it becomes a lot more intuitive, because I can be like, okay, it's a quarter note. I understand that. I know that my BPM, if I press play, 1, 2, it's just a fourth note. I can get it faster if I want by just dragging it up to an eighth. And it's funny because when you listen to this stuff, particularly if you're new to synths or you're new to like this whole world of sound design, which is a giant rabbit hole, just to kind of be honest about that. And I think one of the decisions you've got to make is like, how much time do I actually want to spend on this? But you should hear quite quickly that a lot of the stuff that I'm showing you here, you're like, oh yeah, I recognize that kind of sound from X, So like, this kind of thing, you can instantly hear like a kind of Stranger Things-esque vibe going on here with the kind of big synth sound. It's quite dry. You've got the LFOs on it. It's, you're starting to feel that kind of effect. Okay, cool. So, and then on the other hand, you've got what's called vibrato, and vibrato is just a volume-based thing. So this will basically just move. What am I doing here? Sorry. You can feel I'm also introducing like another level of mixing these two together. So I can bring a different rate of vibrato in addition to my LFO. Now I'm really kind of starting to create like a movement now. So one's in 4, one's in 16. In 8 triplets. So you beforehand, that was quite a boring part. Like I basically just had, if I turn this down, that's my single note. As soon as I start to bring the vibrato in, I've now introduced rhythm to that, and I've introduced like a bit of a sway with the two different rhythms. So you're just creating a much more interesting synth part there, like straight away. Okay, cool. So hopefully you kind of understand roughly what that section does at least. Now the other thing you can do is on the bottom right, you've got these two graphs, and these are what are called envelopes. Now an envelope is all about time, and it's about how something behaves over time. So in this case, you can see that you've got 4 settings. So top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. And they're labeled ADSR. And ADSR stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. And what this means is it's the way that something happens over time. So if, for example, you have an attack of 0, it means that whatever it is you're assigning that envelope will happen straight away. Then you've got this kind of this bit here where it falls off after the attack. So this would be your decay. right, is how quickly it kind of goes from the attack point or the transient down to a sustained point. So that line, the second line there, is your decay. Then the sustained line, i.e. this held line here, is this value here. So basically it will allow you to choose how long it sustains for. And then finally you've got your release, which is how long it takes for the note to fade out once released. So it's a very like, this appears all over the place in production and in sound design. And basically what you've got is in this particular instance, you've got two envelopes, one for your amp, which is the output of the whole synth, and one for your filter, which is just for the filter up here. Okay, so if I think for the sake of just of getting you to understand what this does, let's just look at the amp one for a minute. Okay, so in simple terms, if I press this, I'm just going to turn this down for a second. Okay, so this is my envelope. Okay, so this is, I'll come back to why this is happening in a second. So that's what my filter sounds like, right? Now, what I'm going to do now is basically change my attack on here. You feel that going? So it's not just going straight away. It's coming in gradually over time. And that's what the attack does. So if I don't want it to be straight away, and in particular normally in a lot of synths to have that kind of popping quality that comes in with that level of attack, I can soften this up and create a much more like, sounds a bit more like an organ now. Whereas if I play that again, you can feel the kind of like transient attack coming in on that attack. So that's one way of doing it. Now, what I was saying before is the decay, right? Is how long does it take for it to go from the attack point down to the sustain point? And what we're doing here is basically we're saying, okay, like, how steeply does this happen? So to exaggerate this point, if I make it very short and I make my sustain point very low, you can see what's going to happen here, right? It's going to go very loud and then very quiet very quickly. That's probably too quick because you can barely hear that. You can feel it going, bow. So you can kind of see it, do it. You can hear it, in fact, doing what you're seeing on this envelope, which is a very fast attack, very loud. Then it goes very quickly down the decay and then down to the sustain point. And then finally, I've got my release. And I've let go of this now. So if I push this up just so you can hear it. So it's going to take 10 seconds for the synth to slowly let the volume go in the amp. So what you should be able to see here is that you can change very quickly the kind of sound that you're working on. So if I want to just like choose something like this, I've moved that so quickly from a sound that was basically just like a kind of big fat synth sound, which that's what it originally sounded like, and I've moved it to something that feels a lot more plucked, almost like a string instrument. And that's just using my envelope, my amp envelope. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you're going to do one thing with all of this stuff that I've told you, don't forget how much your amp envelope can really change like the quality of something. So if you open up a synth and you're like, I don't like that sound, don't write it off straight away. What you might be looking for is an envelope, not an oscillator or a filter. Because particularly if it's a kind of it's about the quality of the like percussive nature of the synth. Like if you want like a big sweeping open synth, then obviously your envelope's not really going to change that, right? Whereas if you want something that's quite tight and has like a percussive feel to it, and needs to be kind of like moving quite quickly, then your amp envelope is going to really help you achieve that. So yeah, don't write it off. The other thing is, let's look at where your envelope can be applied to another setting. So if you are someone who is using Serum, or you're using something like Massive or a more advanced synth, basically Alchemy does the same thing. What you'll see is that you've got envelopes which are applied to another setting. So in this case, what's happening is my filter is controlled by my filter envelope. So what that means is that I will be able to control how quickly the filter takes effect. So at the moment, actually I'll reset this just so it's a bit of a less, yeah, that was my old synth sound, right? So what I can do here is the more I push into this, see, the envelope. So you can feel it going up and then down to the sustain. If I really exaggerate these, you can start to play with how your filter and your envelope interact, right? So again, like if you're picking a filter and you feel like you don't necessarily want it to just be static, obviously your LFO is a good option for that. That's cool. But like, and that will create movement over time. But like, this is a good way of just creating like a kind of percussive and like time-based approach to your filters. So so yeah, that's Retro Synth. So you'll notice up here that I'm in the analog setting of Retro Synth. Actually, before we carry on, I forgot to go into Flanger. So I'm not going to go too much into what Flanger is, but the long and short of it is that basically if you take two signals, if you take the same signal and you copy it, and you put one slightly later than the other, and you basically move it slightly in and out of time, what happens is you create a kind of sweeping effect, like. So there's a family of effects that are very closely linked, which is flanger, phase, and chorus, and they all play with that effect. They play with the fact that if you put two things like in and out of time with each other, they kind of start to create like a phasing effect, and you get that kind of kind of sound. That's, in a nutshell, that's what we're talking about here. So if I put the flanger right in, can you hear it going? So it's just another way of introducing like a bit of flavour to your sound here. And what you would want to do ideally here is you would want to make this rate, which is what whenever you see something that's in hertz, you're dealing with whenever you see something on a synth that's in hertz, you're normally dealing with what's called a rate, right? And the rate is the frequency at which something happens. So in this case, you're dealing with 1.4 hertz, which is a very slow wave. So it's going to be like, it's just going to create a movement. Now, in this case, it's kind of difficult to tell what what that rate would need to be. So there's a couple of ways that you can figure it out. First one would be to use your sync option here. So if I know that I've synced my thing to a quarter note, I can turn back and see what the rate would be, and then I can apply that there. Another way is actually in Logic, you've got this little function here. So if you go to region at the top left and you click on delay, you can actually see like all of your different times here. And I thought that that had rate, but it doesn't. But you are able to use like converters and things online to either move from milliseconds to rate, or if you put your milliseconds to hertz, or if you put your BPM in, you can also like calculate from like an eighth note what the milliseconds and what the hertz of the like wave that would be that time would be. So like there's a couple of options to do that if you're stuck, and it's just a good idea to kind of like start thinking about your rate and any kind of timings like these, your attack timings, your decay timings, as denominations of your BPM. It's a really big step if you can do that, because like if you're coming to this as a beginner and you're looking at something like Glide and you're just like, oh, it's just like 14 milliseconds. I don't know. Is that the right amount of milliseconds? Like, is it 14 or 15 milliseconds? Like, obviously you can do it by ear, but if you can, like, try and get it to a place where you like it by ear, and then you could be like, okay, well, what's it closest to in terms of my denomination to my BPM? So if it's, for example, closest to, in this case, like a 96th, which would be 20 milliseconds, you might want to put it there. Now that's quite a small amount of time, so it probably wouldn't make that much of a difference. Whereas if you're dealing with a longer amount of time, like 125. If you're at 115, try at 125, and you'll probably find is that it will move more in time, which will help you to build something that feels more coherent. So whenever, even not just in synths, with everything else, reverbs, the whole like compression and release times, everything, like try and think about time in Logic as related to your BPM, and try and always bring it back to that. And if you can, and frankly you've got the you've got the time and energy, try and convert it to like, you know, a denomination of your BPM in the way that I just showed you. So yeah, so that is your kind of whip through of retro synth. You've also got a chorus effect in here as well, which gives you a different flavour. Now a lot of oops, sorry. This will basically give you the illusion that there's multiple synths playing at the same time, in a nutshell. But it's a really nice way of creating width as well in your track, because what it will basically do is pan, if I'm right in this one, it will pan left and right a copy of the synth, and then detune it and bring it slightly out of time, so it feels like the kind of whole thing is just like a group of synths playing. It's an effect, try it out, but it's a pretty classic effect on most synths.